Dr. Roberto, and learn from her for the trainees, for you all to meet with her and talk to her about what she's doing. And so to get us going, I wanted to introduce you, Isan Kavechi. You probably ruined the name pronunciation. Isan is a graduate student in sociology, one of our data science and demography trainees, very actively engaged on a number of projects at UW, and really delighted. He's the one who suggested to us that we invite Liz. So we're really happy for that. And without further ado, it's turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll just do a quick introduction to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is an assistant professor in Department of Sociology at Rice University. She has broad research interests in social and spatial inequality with a substantial focus on residential segregation. Sorry for that. And methodological expertise on computational social science and quantitative methods. Her research integrates a classic sociological interest in the social organization of cities and the development of innovative methods to address fundamental questions about spatial structure of residential segregation, the causes and consequences of segregation processes, in particular of segregation at different geographic scales, and the role of built environment in segregation processes. In particular, she studies how physical barriers and broad connectivity or disconnectivity, spatial structure, segregation patterns, and contribute to their persistence. And Dr. Roberto received a PhD in sociology from Yale University and an MPA and BA from George Washington University. After completing her PhD, she was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology at Princeton University, funded by the James McDonald Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award in the Study in Complex Systems. She previously was a presidential management fellow and research analyst at the U.S. Department of Transportation and held positions at Brookings Institution and the Government Accountability Office. Her research has been supported by the American Sociological Association and the National Academies, among others. And her work has appeared in social methodology, spatial demography, social science and medicine, and other academic journals. And without further ado, I'll welcome Elizabeth Roberto. Thank you.
Thank you, Isan, for the introduction, and thank you to Sarah and CSDE staff for inviting me to come and coordinating all the logistics of my visit. I want to start by acknowledging my collaborators on this research, Yu Zhu, Santiago Segarra, and Jaleh Jalili, and the support we received from an Interdisciplinary Excellence Award from Rice University. The goal of my research is to develop deeper insight about the complex relationship between the social and built environment of cities. I'm particularly interested in the way that physical barriers and disconnected roads have been used to create separate spaces and are recognized by residents as visible markers of social division. A great example of this is the metaphor, the other side of the tracks. This term makes intuitive sense to us because train tracks often divide segregated areas of a city. And not only train tracks, highways, fences, dead-end streets, they also divide cities. This division can result in distinct social conditions and experiences for residents, such as differences in economic resources or the quality of schools. Some physical barriers were originally constructed with an intention to racially segregate nearby populations or to reinforce existing patterns, such as the construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway, shown here on the left, in Chicago's South Side in the 1960s. It separated white and Black residents on opposite sides of the highway. Some of these barriers continue to facilitate segregation today, and new barriers continue to be put in place, such as fences and dead-end streets. The photo shown here is a fence along the border between New Haven and Hamden, Connecticut. Hamden is a neighboring suburb of New Haven. New Haven received more federal funding for urban renewal in the 1950s than any other US city. And that money was used for large-scale demolition and construction projects. The city still bears many of the scars from that period. This is a 12-foot high, 1,500-foot-long fence that was originally constructed in 1951. It cut off all connectivity. So the fence in the map is here, and it cuts off all connectivity between white homeowners in Hamden and Black public housing residents in New Haven. And if the ball in this photo were to go over the fence, it'd be a 2.5-mile walk to retrieve it on the other side. That's the extent of the disconnect. In recent years, proposals to remove the fence were met with fierce opposition from Hamden residents. At one town meeting, a Hamden resident remarked, "You put a street through, you're jeopardizing the lives of everyone in this room."
Is Hamden, I maybe missed this,
Yeah.
Hamden on the,
Hamden is up here
okay,
and New Haven is here. So this is where the fence would be cutting off these streets for New Haven residents. So you can see through this fence of single family homes in Hamden. So this fence did finally come down in 2015, but there's many examples from other cities about new barriers being built. So for example, officials in Grosse Pointe Park, which is a suburb of Detroit, have tried a number of not so subtle strategies to block streets coming to or from Detroit. One such example is at Kirchville Avenue and Alter Road, which is shown here. In the photo on the left, you can see that in February 2014, they plowed all of the snow into this intersection, completely blocking connectivity. This is in the middle of the road here. And then in that following summer, they erected a platform and a shed for a weekly farmers market. That shed opens to the Grosse Pointe Park side, and the back is to the Detroit side. Then when it was ultimately decided that they had to provide some connectivity, they erected a roundabout with these person-sized potted plants, which provides some ability to walk through the intersection, but very little ability to drive through. There's a one-way small lane allowing cars to move through. This isn't the only example of this happening in this border between Grosse Pointe Park and Detroit. There's 5 or 6 other roads connecting the two municipalities that have been blocked or altered. Here are 2 other examples. This first one on the left is looking on the Detroit side of Brook Street, the crossing there, which blocks all connectivity, including sidewalks. And then the one on the right is Goethe Street. So there's only about a dozen streets that could potentially go through along this border, and most of them are now blocked. So these physical barriers combine the strength of symbolic boundaries with the durability of physical infrastructure to facilitate persistent racial divisions. This is important because segregation has wide-ranging consequences, including access to healthcare and the quality of schools and policing. And high levels of segregation continue to persist in US cities despite the passage of civil rights legislation that makes housing discrimination illegal. Segregation has long been a central topic of concern for sociologists, but despite a large literature on segregation, there are critical aspects that we don't understand well. Because we've largely ignored the built environment when studying the patterns and processes of segregation. And the key reason for this is that we haven't had the methods to capture this dimension of segregation. In my previous work, I've developed methods for measuring residential segregation that consider how the built environment affects the proximity and connectivity of locations. I do this by measuring segregation spatially for local environments. Local environments are like egocentric neighborhoods around each location that can vary in size. In this map, I'm showing a local environment that is 0.5 kilometer in size. So I do this by measuring segregation spatially for these local environments using the distance between locations along the road network. which takes into account the excess distance imposed by physical barriers. And I compare that to segregation measures using straight line distance, which ignores the built environment and represents complete connectivity. So you can see here the difference. This is actually, part of Pittsburgh, and there are train tracks running through the center of this map, and very little connectivity crossing the train tracks. So you can see what the local environment would be if we use straight line distance. This circle encapsulating all locations within 500 meters of the focal location, which is the center here. And you can see how truncated the road distance local environment is, indicated by just those nodes that are purple here. Those are the locations that would be included when we take into account the road distance rather than the straight line distance between them. Okay, so the road distance measure takes into account that these railroad tracks are a source of disconnectivity and separation, rather than ignoring them and pretending that nodes on either side are immediately reciprocal. Using this method, I've found that physical barriers and road disconnectivity are associated with higher levels of segregation in areas within each of the 30-some cities I've studied. However, it doesn't allow me to analyze if there's a relationship between disconnectivity and differences in the racial composition of nearby areas, or how much a single missing road segment contributes to segregation in the surrounding areas. So I've developed a novel approach to construct counterfactual road networks by identifying missing road segments that we would expect to exist in the road network given the surrounding infrastructure. In this talk, I'm going to describe the method that my collaborators and I have developed and demonstrate the method by examining two empirical questions. First, is there a systematic relationship between road disconnectivity and differences in the racial composition between nearby areas? And what we find is that racial differences are associated with unexpected patterns of disconnectivity. Road segments that we would expect to exist given the surrounding infrastructure are more likely to be missing between areas with different racial compositions. Second, we ask, is disconnectivity associated with racial residential segregation? And we find that unexpected disconnectivity contributes to higher levels of segregation in the local areas of missing road segments and at the city level. I'll discuss results for the 5 Rust Belt cities that are included in our methods paper, as well as 5 additional cities that are included in the next phase of this project. So in order to identify missing road segments that we would expect to exist in the road network, we need to rely on theories about the growth of the underlying network. This presents an interesting challenge because commonly used edge propensity scores are designed for social networks and are based on underlying social mechanisms such as homophily. So here on the left, you can see an example of a social network where people have interests, and we could imagine that if we were to predict the likelihood of 2 individuals having a tie, we could look at their interests and we would think that people who have shared interests might be more likely to have a tie between them. But in the absence of existing methods for road networks, my collaborators and I developed a novel approach for estimating edge propensity in the road networks. Our goal is to identify road segments that one would expect to be present given the surrounding infrastructure, but are nonetheless missing. And we do this not to make recommendations about road construction, but rather to examine the significance of unexpected missings. By doing so, we're trying to uncover the inequalities that are embedded in urban infrastructure and highlight mechanisms of infrastructural racism. Now I'm going to walk you through the 6 steps of our method. First, we construct the observed road network using publicly available geographic data from the US Census Bureau in their Tiger Line shapefiles. Road segments are the edges in the network, and the nodes in the network are the intersections or endpoints of roads. In constructing the road network, we exclude edges such as walking paths and trails, and we include roads that are classified as highways, local roads, alleys, and other similar road features. We treat the nodes as a fixed attribute of the network, so in this process, we're not adding or removing any of the nodes. Next, we characterize the existing road network using the maximum distance between two connected nodes and the angles of connected road segments. This captures the scale of the road network and how grid-like the network is. Third, we use these network features to constrain the set of edge candidates. These are road segments that are not currently in the network, but could plausibly exist. We restrict potential edge candidates to those that would connect to existing residential streets rather than to highways or ramps. And the length of an edge candidate can be no longer than the maximum straight line distance between an edge's endpoints in the observed network. So we're unlikely to identify an edge candidate between two nodes that are very far apart. We're also more likely to identify several road segments that connect two distant nodes through an intermediate node rather than a single edge connecting. An edge candidate that shares an endpoint with an existing edge and points in almost the same direction is also unlikely. We remove unreasonable potential edges based on these conditions to identify a set of edge candidates that have similar characteristics to those already present in the city. Next, we estimate a utility score for each of the edge candidates. I call this utility score and a propensity score pretty interchangeably throughout the talk. This score represents the average reduction in shortest path length between nodes in the local area of the candidate edge, if the edge is added to the network. So it's how does it change the distance between all of the nodes in the local environment if we include that edge in the network? And we normalize this value by the length of the candidate edge. So per unit of candidate edge, how much is everyone's distance to each other reduced? We compute a utility score for each edge candidate as well as all of the existing edges. Fifth, we add edge candidates to the network sequentially according to their utility and discard edge candidates that are redundant with higher utility edges. Several edge candidates may share a single node, but when constructing the counterfactual network, we would want to include one of these candidates, but not all of them. So we sort the candidates by utility and add them in an ordered fashion to the network, making sure that competing edge candidates are removed if they violate the conditions that I explained earlier, or after having added other higher utility edges. This is the set of edge candidates that we use in our analysis. So the compatible set that reduces the redundancy. And finally, in the sixth step, we evaluate if our choice of edge utility is reasonable by comparing the scores of observed and counterfactual edges in the same areas. We would expect that observed edges, those that actually exist in the network, would tend to have a higher utility score than the edge candidates. In Hartford, for example, the average utility scores of existing edges and edge candidates are about 1.03 for the existing edges and 0.32 for the edge candidates. For a more detailed validation procedure, we count the number of edge candidates that share an endpoint with each existing edge. And that's represented here as the blue bars. And this is a figure for Hartford, Connecticut, just to provide an example. A large fraction of the existing edges, my screen just shut off.
Tap the screen.
Okay, so I have something.
Sorry.
That's okay. So when I exit. Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, save the day. Okay, so a large fraction of existing edges do not have alternative candidates. That's where X is equal to 0. But in cases where there is an alternative edge candidate, we count how often the existing edge has a larger utility value than the edge candidates. And that's represented by the orange bars in the histogram. In most cases, existing edges tend to have larger utility scores than their alternatives. So for example, in Hartford, 732 of the existing edges have a single competing candidate edge. And in 513 of those cases, the utility of the existing edge is larger than that of the alternative, and that's shown here. So in Hartford and across the cities that we've studied, an observed edge has greater utility in well above 50% of the cases, which provides support for our measure of edge propensity. To demonstrate the application of our method, we analyzed racial composition and segregation in 10 US cities that capture a range of sizes. We conduct both a global analysis at the city level and a local analysis in the immediate area of each of the candidate edges. To measure segregation, we use the spatial proximity and connectivity method. We use publicly available population data for census blocks and estimate the population count and composition for each node in the road network. We then calculate the shortest distance between all pairs of nodes along the road network. This allows us to construct local environments around each node that are sensitive to the sources of connectivity and disconnectivity. And we calculate the population composition of each local environment. We then use the divergence index to measure segregation for Black, Latinx, and white residents. The divergence index measures the same concept of segregation as the dissimilarity index, the evenness dimension of segregation. It measures the difference between the composition of each local environment and the city's overall composition. So if there's no difference, if each local environment is a microcosm of the city as a whole, then the segregation score is 0. And greater differences produce higher segregation scores. By using the SPC method, we're able to measure segregation in a way that's sensitive to sources of connectivity and disconnectivity. So first, I'm going to discuss the global analysis, and these are the results on the difference in segregation at the city level. We calculate segregation using the observed road network and then compare that to segregation measured for counterfactual road networks. The missing road segments for edge candidates are added to the counterfactual network, starting with the highest utility edge candidates. The results are plotted in blue for one of our cities. This is for Hartford again. The value with 0 edge candidates added is that corresponds to the segregation index of the observed city without any additional edges. As we start to add edges, the tendency is for the segregation index to decrease. Next, we'd like to determine whether edge propensity is related to the decrease in segregation, or if it's due only to the increase in connectivity by adding the additional edges. So to test this, we create a control scenario in which edge candidates are randomly added. So rather than adding them in order of their utility, highest utility to lowest, we just order them in a random fashion and measure segregation for a batch of 10. So for every 10 that we add, we measure segregation. And that random ordering is shown in the orange. We do 10 experiments like this, and what I'm showing here is the mean and standard deviation across those 10 experiments. So notice that both curves coincide when no edges have been added, and that's because this corresponds to the observed city. But for intermediate numbers of added edges, there's a significant difference between the curves, indicating that higher propensity is related to larger differences in segregation. These results are similar for the other cities in our analysis. And I want to note here that our computation of edge utility doesn't include any information about racial composition. So it's particularly striking that we find that the high utility missing road segments largely coincide with those that would contribute the most to segregation. Next, we analyze differences in segregation and racial composition at the local levels within cities. We examined whether unexpected disconnectivity in the road network is associated with differences in racial composition of nearby areas and with higher levels of segregation in those local environments. To conduct this analysis, we measure the racial composition and segregation in the local environments of each of the EDGE candidates' endpoints. And we do this separately with and without the EDGE candidate included in the road network. We then analyze whether there is a statistically significant difference between the observed and counterfactual differences in racial composition using a paired t-test. In other words, we analyze if these disconnected nearby areas become more similar or different in their racial composition when the EDGE candidate is present or missing. And we find statistically significant differences for all 3 ethno-racial groups in all 10 cities. On average, there are larger differences in the local environment composition of an EDGE candidate's endpoints when the EDGE is missing. This trend is particularly pronounced for the Black and white populations of Cincinnati, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, and the Latinx and white populations of Hartford. And this association suggests that unexpected disconnectivity may be more likely between areas with different racial compositions. To examine this further, we use a series of OLS models. We analyze whether the higher propensity missing road segments are more likely to connect areas with different racial compositions compared to the lower propensity EDGE candidates. We find a significant relationship for all cities and racial groups, except the Latinx population of Philadelphia, and it's only marginally significant for the Black and white populations of DC. Overall, this suggests that these highly likely but nonetheless missing road segments facilitate both social and spatial disconnection. This is consistent with prior qualitative findings that found that physical barriers and disconnectivity have been used as mechanisms to reinforce or exacerbate segregation by facilitating greater separation between ethno-racial groups in nearby areas. This map provides an example of the spatial and social division associated with high propensity missing road segments. The map shows the Black, Latinx, and white population composition in an area of Hartford, Connecticut. In the center of the map, the dotted line represents a high propensity EDGE candidate that is missing from the road network, and its endpoints are represented with the asterisk symbols. So that's right here. The solid gray line bisecting the map from north to south represents railroad tracks that divide these 2 areas of Hartford, a predominantly white area to the west and a predominantly Black area to the east. When the EDGE candidate is excluded from the network, the racial composition in the local environments of its endpoints are nearly monoracial. That's because the railroad tracks are cutting off the connectivity, so the local environments would be limited by those railroad tracks. When in comparison, if the EDGE is included in the network, the local environments are more diverse and representative of the city's composition because they include the populations on both sides of the tracks. This difference in racial composition corresponds to a difference in segregation. Segregation is higher by 0.16 for the node to the east and by 0.21 for the node to the west when the EDGE is missing from the network. Next, we examine the relationship between disconnectivity and segregation. We compute the difference between segregation when the road network includes and does not include the EDGE candidate. On average, we find that local segregation is significantly higher when an EDGE candidate is missing from the road network compared to when it's included. We evaluate this with a paired t-test and results are significant at p less than 0.05. The average differences range from 0.004 to 0.022 across the 10 cities. These results amplify the city level findings. These local differences are about twice the magnitude of the city level differences. Despite their significance, the differences may seem relatively small. One reason for this may be that we've included all EDGE candidates in this analysis, regardless of their utility value. And it may be that higher propensity edges have a stronger association with segregation values. So to further understand this, we run a series of OLS models, regressing the difference in segregation with and without the EDGE candidate on the propensity for the EDGE to exist in the network, measured in terms of its utility. And I want to apologize for the small font in this table. In general, we find a negative relationship between EDGE propensity and segregation differences. Higher propensity EDGE candidates are associated with larger negative differences in segregation. The negative association between EDGE propensity and segregation differences indicates that the road segments that are most likely to exist, but are nonetheless missing, are the sources of disconnectivity that contribute the most to higher levels of segregation. Although we normalize our measure of utility to give it a consistent meaning across cities, so you may recall it's the average reduction in shortest path length per unit of candidate edge length. The mean and the range of values for this utility value, it varies across cities. And this is important to keep in mind as the cities with the smallest coefficients for edge utility, such as Philadelphia, also have the largest mean and maximum utility values. So one of the next steps for this project, in addition to expanding to additional cities, is to explain the micro and macro processes that contribute to social and spatial division. We're doing this by identifying the built environment features that facilitate disconnectivity and then tracing the historical origins and evolution of these features. In our preliminary results for Hartford, Connecticut, 37 out of 44 sites include multiple built environment features. The most common features at the site included railroad tracks, highways, undeveloped land, residential areas, commercial properties, and cemeteries. And I want to note that my collaborator on this next phase of the project is Tina Law, who's currently a postdoc at the Stone Center at CUNY. So this is the goal of the next phase of the project, is to examine additional cities and really try to understand the history and the process of these sites of division, again, to try to shine a light on infrastructural racism and how it works in cities. In this paper, we introduce a novel approach that identifies missing road segments that we would expect to exist in a city's road network, given the surrounding infrastructure. In our empirical demonstration, we found that unexpected disconnectivity is associated with differences in racial composition. This suggests that these highly likely but nonetheless missing road segments facilitate both social and spatial disconnection. And this is consistent with prior qualitative findings that these physical barriers and disconnectivity have been used as mechanisms to reinforce or exacerbate segregation by facilitating greater separation between ethno-racial groups. And we find that unexpected disconnectivity is associated with significantly higher segregation in the local areas of missing road segments and at the city level. The road segments that are most likely to exist but are nonetheless missing are the sources of disconnectivity that contribute the most to higher levels of segregation. Rather than being a recommendation about road construction, this paper looks at the significance of unexpected missingness. The preliminary findings underscore the power of the built environment and suggest that infrastructure decisions can have long-lasting social consequences. Overall, this research seeks to uncover the inequalities embedded in urban infrastructure and highlight the mechanisms of infrastructural racism. Thank you.
You can take questions from here and I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, great. Scott?
Super interesting talk. I love seeing someone talk about kind of these built environment road network features and not just using it as like an instrument, which is really great. I think it's super interesting. I had a couple questions. One, I like that you're kind of drilling into the history of the built environment. I think that's really smart. I'm excited to see what that does. Do you think that there's also histories relevant to the residential neighborhoods themselves, like covenants and things that map onto that? And how could you kind of operationalize that? I was just kind of pondering that because those covenants are sticky, just like railroad tracks are sticky. And so I was on that. And then the second question, in places that become gentrified, do we get these connectivity points built? Or do they, I presume that it may be hard to know that, but I wondered if that would be an expectation we might have, that as neighborhoods change and become more affluent or differently composed, these barriers have less meaning and then do they go away?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. So on the first question, in a related project, Shali Jalili and I are looking at the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the way that the built environment affected valuations of areas by analyzing the area descriptions, so that the narrative descriptions of these areas. And so in that project, we would be able to see not necessarily for covenants, but for the redlining process, what's the relationship between the sources of disconnectivity, physical barriers, and the residences themselves, how those are valued and how these areas get drawn. And so for covenants, I think that certainly could play into it. My expectation, so I'm just going to speculate here, is that so I think the built environment compensates for what the legal environment isn't allowed to do. And so if you have restrictive covenants, you don't really need a wall. Because those restrictive covenants, if they can be enforced, are doing the work of what a wall would do. Unless the issue is the comfort and need for protection of the residents, in which case having an area be not visible to them might be a priority. And so that's one aspect. So once those legal mechanisms are removed, historically speaking, that's coinciding with highway construction, urban renewal, and I think that's where we're seeing some of the transformation of the built environment. Now, my work with Tina Law, we'll see if that, to what extent that bears out. If we look at areas that had a lot of restrictive covenants, do we see these built environment features taking their place? Yeah, so I think exceptions to that would be like in Detroit, where along 8 Mile Road, where Jackson talks about the wall that was built in order for the FAA to approve the mortgages for the white homeowners. So that perhaps that was in the absence of covenants, although it would have been during a time period where they could have existed. So more work to be done there for sure. And so for gentrification, I think this is another area where we need more research to try to understand where gentrification is occurring and how the built environment factors into those patterns. Again, speculating, I think it's easier, like if we think one of the mechanisms of gentrification or agents that facilitate gentrification are real estate agents who might be subtly changing the identities of neighborhoods by calling them different things. That may be less possible where you have a physical barrier, like a highway, that divides two neighborhoods. I think it may be harder to try to say, oh, yes, that's part of this neighborhood too, when you do have that physical marker and division in place. So it's unclear to me how gentrification exactly will play out. That's one of the things I'd be interested in exploring. A question that I'm sometimes asked with regards to gentrification is, well, what if you put in a street, right? So if you put in a street, is that gonna lower home values on the wealthier, whiter side of the divide? It's not clear to me that that would be the effect. I think you could see some residential mobility in response to the built environment changing. I think you could also see gentrification happening, where you now have connectivity between the neighborhoods. You might see that the non-white, lower income side of the divide gets gentrified, and you see housing prices increase. So I think there are empirical questions that are important questions to be asking, and hopefully with methods like these, we can start asking them.
We have one online, Steve, and then let you ask the question. Is that okay? Kyle, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, great. Liz, thanks for this great presentation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. So your response to Scott's question makes me want to just hear you two talk, for the next hour or so, but I'll stick to my original question. I'm wondering what you think about as the mechanisms through which the physical discontinuities uphold segregation. Is it that these are kind of physical markers of the edges of neighborhoods that mark belongingness for particular groups and might lead to discrimination against particular groups that try to gain access to those neighborhoods? Is it that these physical barriers are shaping people's daily rounds and might shape their search processes? So what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I think it's all of these things. I think there are many consequences, and part of my work to get at this has involved a collaboration with Elizabeth Corver-Glenn to do qualitative research at these sites of division. In a paper that I hope will be out at some point, we look at places where there is either a symbolic or a physical barrier, and places where it structures racial segregation or income segregation or both. And what we find is these physical barriers that are structuring both racial and income segregation are having big effects for people. So their feelings of belonging, stigmatization among the Black and Latinx population. For the white residents on the other side, it makes the other side invisible for them. And so I think it's creating this social disconnection, both in their minds and in their daily practices, where they're going to the grocery store, who they have social relationships with and where they live. And I think that likely it does inform where people look for housing, and also the way that other kinds of boundaries are drawn. So school attendance areas, for example, are likely drawn in ways that conform to these physical barriers. And so I think that we're just starting to scratch the surface of what this means for residents and the consequences of it in multiple aspects of their lives.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks,
Steve, and then if we have a couple students.
Okay.
Maybe I'll gather a few questions and then you can.
This was super fascinating. Thank you. Mine's just sort of a technical question. And can you walk us through slide 19 again? It felt like it was important. I didn't know what was happening, but yeah.
Okay, so the blue line represents the change in segregation when we add the candidate edges in order of their propensity score. So we're adding the highest propensity edges first. And then towards the end, we're adding the lowest propensity edges. In the orange, this is when we just add the edges in random order. So we expect that there's some reduction in segregation just by adding connectivity,
Right.
regardless of what that connectivity is. But we think that this edge propensity is capturing something important about these edges. So that's what this comparison is. So just raw connectivity effects compared to connectivity that's ordered by propensity. And some cities, what we see is really extreme. Like if you look at Miami,
Yeah.
it's like almost a straight line down. So just in my very preliminary look at the maps for Miami, it looks like there are some, because of all the waterways, there are some candidate edges that would just do a huge amount for segregation and connectivity, and then some that are really just not so important. And here's Seattle. So you all can interpret that for me as well.
And
But
this is the whole metro? Or the
this
city?
is, no, this is just
The
the
city
city.
proper. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm gonna ask. I don't know your name actually, so Hewitt. Hewitt?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so great talk. I just was curious about the construction of the edge propensity scores, whether you only consider proximity or if you also allowed for the neighborhood environment to actually inform that. Because in my head, I actually see it the direction the other way where the neighborhood environment informs what built environment features are created. And so I was just curious if you accounted for that in the development of this. And then one other question actually about like what the clinically relevant difference of the segregation is, because I see the differences and I recognize that they're different and that's good, but they're small, and so I don't know what like would be a perceived difference in segregation, and maybe you can speak a little bit.
Yeah,
So
okay.
you might need to repeat those questions because it might be hard for the online audience to hear. So I'm gonna collect a few more.
Okay.
So Lizzie and then Isan and then Courtney.
Yeah, so I was curious, I think this speaks to some themes and a number of questions. If you had any plans to look at this longitudinally, I know like it's like so complex and like super fascinating, and it's hard for me to wrap my head around how that would work, but I was thinking that could help you get at some of the questions about like what it means to have a road and then take it away versus like not having one and then putting one in. And if that could help you get at like the direction of causality between segregation and these barriers.
I was going to ask the same question, because I think because it's like the road in the last, let's say, 10 years ago, the network, the candidate predicts the 10 years later where the road is kind of built and how people like which can at some point maybe will move out because there's no roads, so which can be kind of fuzzy. That might be really helpful.
And then I had a question, kind of clarifying question, that what this you're measuring here is the segregation from these neighborhoods to each other. And if so, have you also looked at the segregation of these neighborhoods from something like a public or social good, like a hospital or a school or a green space? So not necessarily from each other, but to that resource.
I was actually gonna add to that emergency services, fire stations and those kinds of services.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
Okay,
All right.
yours, all yours.
Great question. So the first student, I didn't catch your name.
You want each, that'll be okay.
Can you, so your first question was about if I've included the neighborhood environment in the propensity score?
Yeah, so if you counted it, like what the current segregation metric was for that neighborhood and whether, like, I guess in the actual propensity.
No. So the propensity score only includes information about how the addition of that edge would reduce the shortest path distance between all nodes in that local environment. It includes nothing about race or segregation. And so that's why these results are really striking. That we see a difference in segregation when we didn't include any information about that. And then your second question, yeah, the magnitude of the difference is tough. because it is quite small, especially at the city level. Here we're including edges that have very, very low utility. And we went back and forth about maybe we should just take those out, but we wanted to represent them here just to give the full picture. But I think that what I'm doing with Tina Law is really gonna help to interpret the magnitude of the differences, because we're really homing in on about 20% of the candidate edges and looking at those that have the highest utility, and then looking at for those what are the mechanisms, what's the difference in segregation, how does that change over time. On the plans to look over time, so that project with Tina is one way that we're tackling this, by looking at for specific sites, what does the change look like over time. The tricky thing with doing this method longitudinally is before 2000, there's not good road networks data. So now I could do it for 2000 and 2010, and hopefully at some point for 2020. But before that, it's a huge undertaking to construct the road networks from print maps. And that's definitely, if I do it, will be a post-tenure project. After trying it out a couple times, a few different ways, there may be some machine learning, AI kind of techniques that could be used, but it's all really time consuming and pretty messy. So maybe somebody else will get to it in that time before me, and then I'll just be able to use their data and cite them in every publication. So yes, so that's the current plan. But I think this direction of causality, the project that Tina and I have, will help to get that up. And then Isan, your additional question about does the candidate edge predict which are built? I would expect that it would have really low fidelity, because some of these edge candidates are so they are plausible given the infrastructure, but they may not be practical. They may traverse a body of water that is too big to make it economically sound to build a bridge, for example. And so that's why in this project, we're careful to say this isn't a recommendation about road construction. We're actually trying to look backwards instead of forward. We're trying to say, how much does it matter that this is missing? Not what would be the effect if we added it. And then Courtney, so yes, so this is segregation, this is segregation between all nodes in the city, and averaged over all of those nodes, population weighted average. So I do think segregation to a common place would be interesting. In fact, a few years ago, I started doing this for libraries. So if we thought about the local environments around libraries, how segregated are they? And so if libraries are a potential site of mixing, then what would we expect then based on the residential area? Or if we assign people to their nearest library, what kind of diversity in the population would we expect in each library? But I think that we could do this for hospitals as well, either measuring the distance or measuring if people went to their closest hospital, who would be expected to go there. Firehouses are an interesting one. At least in Houston, firehouses are very evenly distributed, more evenly distributed than just about anything you would think of, which is great, but maybe that's not the case in all places.
Anybody in the audience? Yeah.
How did you, sorry to answer this already, but how did you choose your distance? So you had the local environment as 0.5 kilometer?
Yeah.
And did you look at any other distances, and how does that connect your indicator to the actual segregation that happens?
Yeah, so eventually I would like to expand to more local environment sizes. For this project, we had to make some decisions, and so we chose the 500 meters because it represents like a pedestrian environment. So it's about 1/3 of a mile. It's reasonably small, but not tiny. So I've used everything from 100 meters to 10,000 meters. And to look at the geographic scale of segregation, how it increases or decreases over increasing distances. So here we just decided to focus on the 500 meters to capture that scale of environment that we're particularly interested in. At larger distances, we would expect that the local environments could include the other side of the divide, not all of it, but at some distance you can get around and start to include the other population. Likewise, at the smallest distances, you're not including, most people wouldn't have a site of division in their local environment because it's such a small area. So, but I think doing this comparison empirically would be interesting to do.
Thank you. So students, you get to hang out here with Liz and enjoy her invites. And I think there's pizza outside the door.
Yes, there is pizza coming in.
Try to play.
And oh, thank you so much.
Appreciate the kind of level of detail you provided, but it's
Okay.
really.
Y'all can decide what you can spot.
I'll probably reach out.
One of you make sure that those gifts back to
At point when.
Great. Great.
We've been.
Yeah, I can bring her back to this.
Microsoft reached
And it
out.
might make
I was
sense
gonna say that it's like
headset
AI,
to your,
but-
I don't know, meeting, didn't even have that.
It's like-
It's like
you figure out.
Background anyway, but it does
Seems like it's-
That sounds great.
For
So bring it back.
And I don't know if you
Yeah,
expect this
great.
possibility.
Okay. Yeah, so then you'll with your building algorithm is
Rochester.
the kind of thing that I
So
want.
Very unique.
Yeah.
I think they would be really, I mean, I don't know.
I
the
was
one thing
wondering
is-
others.
Yeah.
Would be public.
Yeah.
I just think that, I think value of having networks historically is
She could
huge.
come up with.
And you can add value add.
Nice figure out.
Actually,
Just food for thought. I was, when you're planning out, I was wondering about your story.
Same for Phoenix.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in some places like that.
Sounds not a very,
Bigger file.
you know, segregated, I mean. it's-
Probably not.
there are segregated.
Depends on if they
Right, yeah, someone, like a doc student created for their.
Organizing it like,
But
okay.
John
if-
Logan at
Yeah.
Brown has created
Only make this much change.
some
in this
network.
space.
There was someone I was at.